Colin stood in my kitchen with one hand flat against the counter and told me, "I need to find myself again." In the same careful tone men use when they want cruelty mistaken for honesty. I looked at the pendant lights, the clean tile, the unopened mail by the fruit bowl, and knew from the stillness around him that this was not a conversation. I did not ask where he meant to go or who he meant to go with, because his lowered voice, his settled posture, and his lack of hesitation had already answered me. I said, "Okay," and the relief that crossed his face lasted less than a second, but it was long enough to tell me he had expected resistance. I went upstairs, packed one small bag with clothes, my laptop, my medication, and the folder holding the deed and mortgage papers, then came back down without touching anything else. When I pulled out of the driveway before midnight, the porch light was still burning behind me, and I already knew he would move quickly because men only sound that calm when the betrayal is scheduled. The next morning, my phone lit up with a security alert from the app I had installed years earlier, back when Colin still treated practical things like they happened by themselves. I opened the feed and watched a locksmith remove the front lock while Colin stood beside him, pointing at the door, as if confidence could turn a lie into authority. I did not cry, because the new deadbolt, the timestamp on the app, and the way he never once looked uncertain told me this had been planned before he ever entered my kitchen. 20 minutes later, Brianna Pike walked up the path carrying a leather weekender and a garment bag, paused once at the step, then disappeared inside when Colin opened the door. I sat on the edge of my hotel bed and watched the screen go still again, not stunned by the woman, but by the speed with which he had tried to rewrite ownership, marriage, and fact. Then I pulled the folder into my lap, touched the deed with my name standing alone where it mattered, and reached for the only call that could make the next 3 days count. I sat at the small hotel desk with the folder open in front of me and laid everything out in rows. Deed first. Mortgage statement second. Closing papers last. The townhouse had been mine from the beginning, bought with money that came through my side of the family and structured in a way Colin never bothered to understand. He had signed utility forms, forwarded insurance emails, carried boxes through the front door, and somewhere inside those easy domestic habits, he had confused presence with ownership. I called Russell Voss, the attorney who had handled the closing years earlier, and when he picked up, I gave him the timeline without pauses, edits, or emotion. Colin's speech in the kitchen, my leaving before midnight, the locksmith at the door, Brianna Pike entering with a bag. Every detail landed exactly where it belonged. Russell did not ask whether I was sure, or whether Colin had a temper, or whether this could still be worked out privately, because the footage had already answered those questions. He moved straight to the only 3 things that mattered, his voice even and spare, asking whether the locks had been changed, whether my name stood alone on the deed, and whether the app preserved timestamps. When I told him yes to all 3, the room around me felt quieter. Not softer, just more precise, as if every loose piece had found the edge that matched it. He told me not to call Colin, not to argue, not to warn anyone, because once records exist, the law works best when nobody gets the chance to reshape them with noise. So I scanned the deed, the mortgage history, the closing packet, and the screenshots from the security app, then sent them all before my coffee had gone cold. I added one email Colin had forwarded months earlier without reading closely enough, a note from Brianna about how a clean break would look better for sponsors. And that line settled hard. Nothing in it sounded accidental, and with the lock footage, her overnight bag, and the house already staged as if I had vanished, I knew I did not need a speech, an apology, or a fight, only enough paper to make the next move hold. Russell brought Garrett Lowell into the file that afternoon, and within an hour my marriage looked less like a private collapse and more like a plan with numbers attached. Garrett did not speak in theories, only in balances, notices, and dates. laying out overdue tax letters, maxed business cards, and a sponsor renewal hanging over Colin's next quarter. The affair had already been ugly, but the documents on Russell's conference table made it narrower, colder, and much easier to understand. Because need leaves a cleaner trail than romance. The first real shift came from a sponsor deck Brianna had built for Colin's relaunch. And when Garrett turned the screen toward me, I recognized my kitchen instantly. The slides called my townhouse, his studio home base. Using my counters, my window light, and my living room as proof of stability for a brand campaign they had no right to sell. That mattered more than any hotel receipt or flirty message ever could. Because once they used my address, my rooms, and my house as leverage, the affair stopped being the whole story. Garrett kept going, page after page, and every new line made the timing from the security footage look less impulsive and more engineered for speed. There was a draft change of address that had not been submitted yet, a scheduled furniture delivery set for the 4th day, and Brianna's email about a clean break looking better for sponsors sitting exactly where it belonged. By then, I did not need anyone to explain motive to me, because the new lock, the overnight bag, the relaunch deck, and the delivery schedule all pointed in one direction. Russell closed the folder, rested his hand on the motion he was preparing, and told me they would move on 2 tracks at once without giving Colin time to reshape the facts. One was a civil standby to restore lawful access and document the lockout, and the other was emergency court relief for exclusive possession, preservation of communications, and protection against further misuse. I left his office with my bag over one shoulder, my phone silent in my hand, and the first clean understanding I had felt since Colin stood in my kitchen and mistook my silence for surrender. On the 3rd morning, I stood outside my own front gate, with Russell Voss beside me and Deputy Dana Klein walking up the path, calm enough to make urgency unnecessary. No sirens cut through the street. No one rushed, and that quiet mattered because the deed in Russell's folder had already done the loudest part. I kept my hands still around my bag strap, watching Dana check my identification against the property records before she nodded once and moved toward the door. Colin opened it halfway, irritation landing first, then uncertainty, and I saw the shift the second his eyes moved from my face to Dana's uniform. Dana kept her voice level and told him they were there to restore lawful access and document a reported lockout involving the legal owner. He started with, "This is my house." She left, but the new deadbolt, the time-stamped footage, and Russell's papers were already in Dana's hand before he finished. I stepped inside with them and felt the house register me before Colin did, because nothing in the entryway belonged to the version of life he had tried to stage. Brianna Pike stood halfway down the hall in one of my Santa Fe shirts, and that shirt mattered because I had bought it myself, washed it myself, and never left it for guests. She looked from Dana to Colin and asked, "What's happening?" And when Dana answered, "We're restoring Ms. Greer's access to her property," Brianna's posture changed before her face did. Colin tried again, softer this time, saying, "I just needed space. We were handling this privately." And Dana stopped him with the kind of courtesy that leaves no room. She told him space did not include changing locks on a sole owner. And when she asked whether he had the lock replaced, his pause did more damage than his answer. Brianna turned toward him then and let out, "You said she'd sign if we moved fast." And the words landed in the room with the same clean force as paperwork. No one raised a voice after that, because the unlocked hallway, the body cam, Brianna's bag on my chair, and Colin's silence had already stripped the scene down to fact. Dana instructed him to make sure I had full access to every part of the house, then documented the lock change, while Russell noted the time and kept his folder closed. I walked past Colin into the living room, saw his podcast equipment set near my windows for sponsor light, and understood from that single arrangement that he had never planned to leave, only to replace me. After Dana left, Colin changed tactics so fast it would have been impressive if the body cam, the lock report, and Brianna's line in the hallway had not already fixed him in place. He lowered his voice, followed me into the kitchen, and tried to make the whole thing sound smaller, murmuring that nobody wanted this to turn ugly and that it was just a lock. I set my bag on the counter, looked at the new deadbolt key Dana had made him hand over, and understood that men like Colin always reach for softness after force stops working. Russell filed the motion that same afternoon, attaching the deed, the app timestamps, Dana's incident report, Brianna's sponsor email, and the relaunch deck built around my house. Garrett Lowell added the financial layer, matching overdue tax notices, maxed business cards, and sponsor pressure to the exact week Colin decided speed could replace legal authority. Nothing in that packet depended on how I felt about my husband, because the new lock, the sponsor slides, and the scheduled furniture delivery had already explained his motive better than anger could. Colin found me again near the stairs that evening and tried one more time, leaning into regret now, saying, "We could work this out privately if I would stop escalating things." I did not remind him that he had brought Brianna into my bedroom, or that he had used my kitchen to sell stability to sponsors, because those facts were already sitting in court filings with timestamps. I only told him, "You were never trying to make this easier, Colin. You were trying to make it fast." And the quiet that followed belonged to him, not me. By the next morning, the first Cradox had spread past the house, because one sponsor asked for clarification and another paused, a call that had been set to close that week. Colin stood in the living room, refreshing his email, while Brianna moved through the house differently now. No longer loose in my space. No longer touching anything she did not need. The podcast gear by my windows, the weekender on my chair, and the shirt she still had folded over her arm made the whole room look temporary in a way it had not the day before. That afternoon, I went upstairs with a clean laundry bag, stripped the bed, folded the sheets, and sealed them away without breaking anything, throwing anything, or needing anyone to watch. The perfume in the room was still hers, but it no longer felt like evidence of victory, only proof that they had confused access with permanence. When I opened the windows and let the cold Denver air move through the room, Colin stayed downstairs speaking in that careful voice again. And for the first time since he stood in my kitchen, it reached absolutely nothing. The hearing moved quickly because Russell did not bring feelings into the room. Only the deed, Dana Klein's incident report, the security timestamps, and the sponsor deck built around my house. Colin came in wearing the same careful expression he had used in my kitchen, as if a softened face could do for him what ownership records would not. I sat beside Russell with my hands folded over the folder I had packed 3 nights earlier, and for the first time, the room felt smaller to Colin than to me. Russell stood, spoke plainly, and walked the judge through the order of facts without ornament. Starting with sole ownership and ending with the lock change, Colin had already admitted. He added the relaunch deck using my kitchen and address, Brianna Pike's email about moving fast for sponsors, and the scheduled furniture delivery waiting behind them. Nothing needed interpretation because the deadbolt replacement, the body cam exchange, and the deck itself had already stripped the story down to intention, timing, and misuse. When Colin's turn came, he tried to pull the whole thing back into marriage language, saying we were separating. Emotions were high, and he had believed I was leaving. The judge did not interrupt often, but when she asked whether my name was the only one on the deed and whether he had changed the lock, his answers narrowed everything. It became painfully clear that he had counted on atmosphere, urgency, and my silence, while Russell had come in carrying records that did not bend. The order came exactly the way Russell expected. Temporary, exclusive possession to me, a supervised window for Colin to retrieve personal property, and preservation of communications tied to the dispute. The judge also barred removal of any item not clearly his, And that mattered because the podcast gear by my windows had already been packaged as future income. By the time we stepped into the hallway, one sponsor had already paused renewal over reputational risk, and Brianna's agency cut her from the relaunch before lunch ended. Colin returned 2 days later with a list, 2 storage bins, and the kind of silence that only arrives after paperwork closes every easy exit. He moved through the house under supervision, lifting shirts, cables, and shoes from rooms he had tried to convert into proof of a newer, cleaner life. I watched from the kitchen while the front door opened and closed behind him in measured intervals. And when the last box left my floor, narrating about the moment felt dramatic, only final. I did not gut the house after Colin left, because the bed, the windows, and the light in the kitchen had not betrayed me. Only the man who moved through them had. I changed the sheets, boxed what was his, repainted the bedroom a softer color, and put my own recording equipment back where his sponsor setup had been. The work felt small while I was doing it, but every lamp I repositioned and every drawer I cleared returned the rooms to the truth they had held before he tried speed. I went back to the station the next week and slipped into my old routines without announcement, letting the clock, the headphones, and the red studio light steady me again. A producer I trusted asked whether I wanted to talk, and I told her, I'm all right enough to work, because that was the most honest shape my strength had then. I did not need a reinvention, a dramatic haircut, or a louder life, because the court order, the empty side of the closet, and the quiet in my house had already given me enough room. Colin asked to meet for coffee, and I agreed because by then the damage was documented. The locks were changed back, and his voice no longer had any leverage. He looked tired in a way I had never seen before, glanced down at his cup, and admitted he thought I would stay quiet long enough for his version to harden. I told him, I was quiet. Colin, I just wasn't gone. And the look that crossed his face belonged to a man finally understanding the difference between silence and absence. Not long after that, Brianna's attorney sent over a short confirmation that she had returned everything that was not hers and wanted no further part in the dispute. Russell handled it cleanly, and I let that be the last place her name lived. Because the folded shirt, the sponsor deck, and the body cam had already said everything necessary. By then, healing no longer felt like trying to forget what happened in my house, only learning how to stand inside it again without feeling displaced. By the time the divorce closed, nothing about the outcome felt theatrical, because the deed had remained mine. The court had followed the file, and the house had never moved. I invited a few friends from the station over one Friday night, set out wine and takeout on my own kitchen counter, and let laughter settle where Colin had staged content. When someone glanced around and told me, "This place feels like you again," I smiled because the windows, the light, and the silence had already been telling me that for weeks. I still thought about the night Colin stood in my kitchen and asked to find himself, but the sentence no longer sounded like an ending once the locks, filings, an empty closet settled into place. It sounded like a line that opened the wrong door for him and the right one for me, because he had mistaken access for ownership and quiet for surrender. The house was still there, exactly where it had always been, but I crossed each room differently now, lighter in my body, clearer in my mind, and entirely untouched by doubt. Thank you for staying with me through this story, and if any part of it felt close to your own life, I hope it left you with something steadier. I hope you find the kind of love that does not ask you to disappear, the kind of home that stays yours, and the kind of peace that holds. If this story stayed with you, stay a while, subscribe, and let me know what part found you, because sometimes being heard is where healing finally begins.